folks at the telescopes, we get big questions like, what happens if you were to fall in a black hole? Can wormholes exist? These questions that may not have real easy answers, but we wanted to tackle them anyway because they're really, really fun. And so this idea of bringing up a show based around big questions around the humanities and science was born. And so this is Lowell42's, third year. We're in our third year now. So it's just been great. Please keep coming to them. We'll promise to have lots of great shows. To introduce our speaker, who is a personal friend of mine, has worked here at Lowell before. She is a grad student and a research technician at NAU at the College of Informatics, Computers, and Cyber Systems, and also at PMI, the Pathogens Microbial Institute. Remembered all of that. And so she's going to give us our talk on something that is kind of up and it's been in our lives a while now, since we've sort of mapped the human genome, and it's these kits that we can get and get our ancestry and send our DNA in. What does it all mean? There's big questions around this, and so Kelsey's going to give us a big look into that. So welcome, Kelsey Banister.
Are you guys doing it good? Okay, cool. So what I want to do is I want to actually start off with a poll here. You guys can all use your phones, so I know this is going to be one of the first, ever take out your phones during a talk thing. But go ahead and take out your phones. Those of you who are streaming in the background, you're also more than welcome to connect your phones from home as well. But what you're going to do is you're going to go to menti.com and you're going to type in that little code there, the 385178. Don't worry if you don't have a phone, you can still participate in person or via the streaming chat if you would like to as well. But I figured since we are going to be streaming today, and since this is a very controversial topic, that I figured I might as well make all of this anonymous. So whenever you guys input your information, it will be completely anonymous, so don't feel ashamed of giving your answers. The whole point of this talk is really to start a discussion. There are no right or wrong answers here, and as a scientist, it's my job and it's my goal to give you guys the information that you need in order to make informed decisions about your lives and the lives of your families. So that's my goal here today. I don't want to shame anyone away from their opinions, which is why we're doing this completely anonymously. So I'll give you guys a minute for that. And then once you are done connecting, it's going to be this here, so you can see how that adjusts. And again, I'll bring this back up if anyone hasn't connected yet. But it's just going to be menti.com, and it's going to be 385178. That's menti.com. Another moment here. And really this is just a preliminary poll just to see what your guys' opinions are right now and your current knowledge sets, what you guys think. Yep, 385178. And so, for those of you who do not have your phones on you or could not see it, the question was, when is manipulating or collecting genetic information okay? So do you think it's okay when it's a life or death situation, so fatal diseases or life or death situations? Do you think it's okay if they're non-fatal diseases? Do you think it's okay for disabilities or defects? What about modifying appearance or sex? And then enhancing skills or performance, to resolve felony crimes, to improve scientific or medical knowledge, and to inform companies and employees, which I realize is probably the one you guys are most interested in. We'll get to that in a little bit. But we'll give this one more moment to kind of see what you guys think, and this poll will change as people are entering in their information here. And don't be ashamed to answer however you think is best. So for those of you who are just now entering, you're going to go to menti.com on your phone, and the current code is 385178 for this question. from trying to manipulate or eliminate or modify, eliminate fatal diseases during life and death situations, and even non-fatal diseases seems to be pretty high up there as well. We can also see that people agree with the felony cases and to improve scientific and medical knowledge. It looks like disabilities and defects is close behind as well. So we're going to go ahead and move on. All right, so during this talk, like I said, my goal is just to give you guys the information you need to have discussion. So most of this will be a discussion, it will be discussion-based using either my computer here, where you guys can raise your hands and you can ask questions in person as well. But we're going to be talking about a couple of things, and I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a heads-up warning that some of the discussions towards the very end of this conversation will be a little bit of a trigger warning that are dealing with sexual crimes. So if you think that's something that might bother you or you're not interested in, you'll stay away from it. Yeah.
Why are the police that you need to know my gene solid?
Yeah, and we'll go over that. And so we'll go over that towards the end. And so, is that?
I will wait till the end.
I'm just going to give some background first, and then we're going to dive right into it. Does that sound okay? Yeah. But basically, so what she asked is, why do the police need our genes to solve crimes? And the answer, kind of in a simple form, is that when crimes are committed, if DNA is left behind, we can use that DNA to isolate groups of people, namely family groups, in order to limit down the subject groups.
But if I'm innocent, why do they need it?
Yeah, and so we'll go over that. So that's what this whole discussion is about, right? So there is a pro and a con to every single one of these, right? So in the case of the police, there are pros and cons. Like, it's great that they can use this information to find criminals, but it's also, what are they doing with your information? Why do they need your information to find these things as well, right? So that comes across a couple of different things here. But some different topics, some headlines that we're going to be going over today. The birth of twins after genome editing for HIV resistance. Can we cure deafness and blindness, and should we? A celebrity biohacker who sells DIY gene editing kits is under investigation. And the ingenious and dystopian DNA technique police used to hunt the Golden State Killer. Okay, and so that Golden State Killer one will be at the very end if you guys are not wanting to talk about that. Yeah, so I'm going to just go over some basics here first, like what is DNA, right? We've all heard the term, but what is this thing that is talked about all the time, right? And so DNA, you have some of the very fundamentals. You have your A's, C's, T's, and G's, right? So you have your adenine, thymine, cytosine, and your guanine, right? And so those pair together in order to create your DNA, creating a double helix. So once they all attach together, they curl up and create a double helix there, right? And so this double helix is really important because your DNA is basically a code. You can imagine it as like a computer code almost that is telling you what is inside your body and what your body should be doing. And so we have a good old Jurassic Park quote down here. A DNA strand like me is the blueprint for every living thing, right? One of my other favorite quotes is that if you change the blueprint, you change the living organism, right? So if we change around these A's, C's, T's, and G's, then we're going to create something else, right? And our DNA, what it does is it creates RNA, and then that RNA creates proteins. Those proteins are valuable for a variety of different reasons, like management within your cells and your body. It can create enzymes and hormones, the proteins that create up the structure and, that create your hair color, your eye color, your height, all that kind of stuff, right? And so this is why DNA is so important. We can do a lot of stuff with it. So what is your genome, right? So your genome is all of those A's, C's, T's, and G's that are in all of them, so that are also called nucleotides, right? Or bases. And so all these A's, C's, T's, and G's that are within your body are comprised of your genome. So that's the total set of your A's, C's, T's, and G's, right? And so you can see up there in that little corner up there, you can see a chromosome. It's that little X-looking thing, right? And so we have 23 of those. So we have 23 chromosomes. You might have heard of 23andMe, right? So the DNA genotyping company. So they will take some of this information and they will use that to gather information about yourself, right? And so we have 23 chromosomes in our body, and those chromosomes are basically a little package of all of our DNA. So our DNA is wrapped up into these little chromosomes, packaged up nicely, and we can open up these chromosomes and open up this DNA in order to get genetic information about yourself. So you can just imagine that if your genome is a book, and you were to open that book and look at a chapter or a line, that would be your gene or any information of interest that you were looking for, right? All right, so what are mutations, right? So I feel like most people have two kind of ideas of what a mutation is, right? So you have your, superheroes, but you also have your monstrosities down here, and then you have, of course, everyone that's normal, like me and you, in the middle, right? So every single one of us is a mutation at some degree or another, but there are some more serious mutations, right? So most mutations don't do anything. So those changes in the A's, C's, T's, and G's might not do anything at all. However, there are some changes that can lead to serious effects, right? So for example, we have an insertion here. So you can see our A's, C's, T's, and G's right up here. And then you have an A being added in at some point during the DNA replication process. So your DNA is being copied and just inserts an A right in there. And so that insert is actually going to create a different protein, or it's going to shift the code. So now what you thought was one protein is going to be a different protein, right? And so something like that can lead to Huntington's disease, for example. Then you have a deletion, which is the exact opposite, to where you have your A's, C's, and T's, and G's, but one or two or several of those bases are deleted from your code, right? And so now that you're missing some of that information, it can change the proteins that are developed, and so then you can get something like cystic fibrosis. Okay. We also have substitution, and substitution is when you change out one base for another. So right here you can see we're changing out that G for a T, and that can lead to things like sickle cell anemia. Okay. And so how can we edit our genome, right? So you've all seen these crazy diagrams on TV of all this super fancy high-tech kind of things. It's not really any of this, right? And so we don't have fancy computers that do all this for us. I wish we did. That would make my life way easier. But we don't, right? And so what we do use is we use something called CRISPR-Cas9. Has anyone heard of that? Hey, there we go. All right, so CRISPR-Cas9, right? So that is basically this little guy right here. So this blue thing is going to be your Cas9 molecule, right? So this is your CRISPR-Cas9 complex. In the center there that's highlighted, you have your DNA, and so that's going to be your target DNA. And so that's going to be your DNA of interest. So if you're looking to change someone's genome, you would use that target spot right there. That target is going to come down, it's going to find, just by random chance, it's going to find an area, and it's going to check to see if it matches. And so now it's checking to see if that red strand is matching the blue strand of interest, and if it does, what it's going to do is it's going to cut your DNA and break it apart. And so now you have a very accurate precision in your DNA where they are looking for a specific region, and they cut it open. Now what you can do is you can leave that cut and just see if your cells can repair the cut itself. And what's going to happen a lot of times is that it's going to mess up and it's going to do the wrong thing, and then that gene will turn off, or it will do something different, and we can analyze how that changes a certain disease or gene or illness of any sort. We can kind of see how turning off that gene or manipulating it might affect it. But we don't know how that happens, or we don't know what's going to happen. It could be what we don't want. In this case, what we're doing is we make that cut and then we give it some template DNA or some DNA of interest. So now say that we want to take out the gene that we do not want. Just pause this. But say that we have a gene there that we did not want and we wanted to replace it with a healthy gene. In that particular case, we could cut it out and then put in a healthy piece of DNA, right? And so for this talk, we're going to be mostly focusing on removing that bad piece and inserting a healthy piece. So here's a real, so this is a live image of it. And so you can see that big glob right there is actually that Cas9 complex, that CRISPR-Cas9 complex. And right now it just landed on there and it found the DNA of interest. That long stringy thing that big blob is attached to is the DNA. And you can see that blue arrow is pointing to when the Cas9 actually cuts the DNA. So the CRISPR-Cas9 complex cuts the DNA, and that's what's happening there. So that's an actual image. What's really cool is that, so your DNA is like a code or a blueprint, right? So we can actually manipulate this code or blueprint. And what these scientists did, which is absolutely incredible, these Harvard scientists, essentially what they did is they took some information and they told each pixel in this image to be a different genetic code. And so then they took that genetic code and they inserted it into bacteria, and then they took it back out and they looked to see if that was able to make the changes and actually make an image from that DNA. And so they took several cells, lots of bacteria, they inserted DNA in there that coded for a specific pixel, and then they took the DNA back out after it replicated several times, and they checked to see if it was actually able to replicate an image, and it was. A pretty good accuracy, right? I mean, there's some little gaps, some pixels went haywire, but for the most part, it looks pretty good, right? So they're using this as research for things like living computers, right? So biological computers. What can we store in our DNA? Our DNA just doesn't have to be code for what creates us, but we can use DNA to store other things. So maybe computers in the future will actually be storing on complexes similar to DNA rather than what we have now.
About vice versa.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can start putting computer code into your DNA too, and just using it as storage, right? Or, you know, the other way around, just turn us into computers. So we have two different types of gene therapy here. So you have germline therapy and you have somatics therapy. And what germline therapy is talking about is it's talking about your sex cells, so your egg and sperm. Okay, so when we make edits to your egg and sperm, it's going to change, hypothetically, all of the cells within your body, but it could not work the way that we expect it to. You could get mosaicism, which is going to change just some of the cells in your body, so half of it, and kind of create mosaic, which is where the word comes from, where some of your cells are modified and some of them are not. But it could hypothetically change all the cells in your body, and then once this person or you reproduces, those edits or those changes would be passed on to your offspring. You have somatic gene therapy, and somatic gene therapy is going to be just your body cells. So these are not the cells that are involved in reproduction. These are just going to be cells that are involved in your current living state, right? So if we were to make changes to these cells, like say we were to make changes to your heart cells or to your liver cells, it would just happen to your heart or liver cells, just the area that we targeted, and it wouldn't really go anywhere else, hypothetically. And it wouldn't actually be passed down to your offspring, so it would stay in you and you only. All right, so now we have some ethical considerations given that basic information. Let's talk about safety. Now that you know these basic things and some of the stuff that you may have learned in the past or some things that you have concerns about, what are some safety concerns that you guys might have? And so we can go ahead and use our poll here. You can also raise your hands if you would like to, but we can use our poll here, and this time the code is 610451. And so this is menti.com, 610451. And so those of you here and those of you online can both participate in this. You're just going to go to menti.com. You're going to hit in 610451. And give us what you think might be a pro or a con in the area of safety when genetically modifying or collecting information, genetic information. What do you guys think? Yeah.
Well, right now you can't guide the CRISPR. It sounds like it just attaches where it is.
Yeah, so you can actually guide the CRISPR. So the CRISPR you can put in target DNA. So say you have a gene and you know the sequence of that gene. You can give it that little piece of DNA, which is that little red piece. So you can give it that piece of DNA into the complex itself, and it's only going to actually attach where it finds a matching pair. So it's actually very precise, but it can make errors still, yes.
What was the number again?
It is 610451. Sorry, it's moving away from the mic.
610.
0451. Yeah, and so we have a really good, this first one up here, a really good point here. So we're editing a genome we do not fully understand yet, right? So we know a lot about our genome, but we don't know everything. We don't know what everything our bodies do, and we don't know how everything reacts with each other. So it's very possible that we might miss something that could have a positive or negative result, right? Yep, and that's also a good one. So let's look at that yellow one. So causing humanity to split between modded and unmodded humans, right? So then you get speciation between humans. And so one of the concerns here is separating the wealthy and the poor, or possibly separating cultures, or races, or religions, right? And so that's another issue that we have. Yep, DNA can go haywire, doesn't achieve the desired results. Exactly, so you could do something to your genome, and maybe it does kind of what you expect it to, but maybe it also doesn't, right? So when I said mosaicism, that's a good example of that. You might have that edit take place in half of your cells, but in the other half of your cells, it does not take place. So you have some healthy cells and some unhealthy cells that you could still get disease, right? And so what if the edits in the gene go wrong? Exactly. So what if you make those edits and it doesn't do what you expect it to, but it does something actually bad, right? So what if 5, 10 years, 50 years down the line, there's some unforeseen change that happens, right? Because our bodies don't stay the same our whole lives, right? Our bodies change throughout our lives. So what if something later on in life happens and it becomes a negative or positive result? So what if the edits don't work as expected, or the tests don't work as expected? So what if you do a test and you're just looking for a gene and you're not actually changing it, and you're just looking for it to see if it's there? So what if you look for it and you get the wrong information, right? Sometimes there are multiple genes that are involved in one process, right? So there might be something like a disease, or maybe our eye color or something like that we would like to change, but it actually requires changes in numerous genes. So what happens if we only change one, right? If we only change one, that could not have the desired results. When do the risks outweigh the benefits? So I'm going to ask you guys that question. So would you do this in your somatic cells or your germline cells? Your germline cells are going to be your sex cells, so your eggs and sperm, and your somatic cells are going to be your body cells, right? So that's not going to be passed down to your children. Do you see a bigger risk in one than the other? Kind of, right? Yeah. And so that's something else that we need to consider. Would these changes be okay if we were just doing it to our body cells? Would they not be okay if we did it to our germline cells? And then could this lead to a slippery slope, like you guys have said? And so, again, this could lead to speciation, right? So what if it happens to change the way that human society is built, right? Now we have 2 races or 3 races of human. So it could cause even bigger divide than we already have between the wealthy and poor, between races, culture, religion. But on the plus side, what if this got rid of all disease? Would you guys risk it if it got rid of all disease in humanity? Maybe? All right, so now we're going to go.
I have a quick
Yeah,
question.
absolutely.
The challenge you have is all these viruses, they do mutations.
Exactly.
So I remember just 10 years ago, I hit a Z-pack for a bacterial infection, and wiped it out right away. Today, they don't even want to give you a Z-pack, so like they're ineffective.
Right, yeah.
Because the viruses mutate.
Absolutely.
So
So
you
viruses.
just gotta go back and forth, back and forth. Back and forth.
Yeah, viruses and bacteria mutate
Yeah,
on a regular basis and very rapidly, right? So that's why when you guys hear a lot about antibiotic resistance, which is a huge issue right now, and another reason why it's so difficult for us to cure things like HIV, right? Because HIV mutates very rapidly. So, but what if I were to tell you that we could modify our genome in a way in which the diseases of the viruses or bacteria could no longer affect us negatively? Because now we aren't using another drug or another molecule to interact with this thing. Now we are actually changing the physical structure of our bodies, of our cells, in which the bacteria may not be able, or the viruses may not be able to even attach to our cells or interact with our cells in a negative way.
Like how they can't make a rock sick.
Right.
If you knew for sure it wasn't going to affect anything else,
Right.
then how do you know for sure?
Exactly.
When you start tampering, you don't know what's done.
Yeah, so there again, pros and cons, right? And so we're going to go into informed consent now. So what do you have as far as consent? So if you were to get your genetic information, what would you be worried about when you had that information? And so the code for this one is 183163. That's 183163. And so what concerns do we have for consent? If you were to have your genetic information and it was just out there, you had it, would you want other people to access it or not? And what other concerns might you have? Pros or cons to people having access to your genetic information? Yeah.
Insurance coverage.
Yeah, so insurance, right?
People have the information they can use against you.
Yeah, so information they can use against you, and that goes along with the insurance, right? So what if insurance gets a hold of your genome, right? They have your genetic information, and so now they know what your predisposition for different diseases is, right? So they look at your genetic code and they're like, ah, this person has a 50% chance of collecting this disease, we're going to increase their rates, right? So what if that would happen? Yeah.
What if people just don't like your genome? Or so they come after it?
Yeah, exactly. And so kind of looking at that from the opposite perspective, what if the military wanted our information and they wanted to use that in order to selectively select people for the military? What about that?
For any? For jobs?
Yeah, for jobs. So let's kind of think about here. First of all, is it even possible to obtain consent? So if you are the one who's modifying yourself, you're able to give consent, right? But what if you are modifying your sex cells? You're not going to be just modifying yourself anymore, right? You're actually going to be modifying your children and your children's children and their children. So how do you obtain consent when you're modifying someone who is not even alive yet, right? Especially when you don't know the downstream consequences. The downstream consequences might be positive, they might be negative. And here's another idea. So is your genetic information yours alone? What do you think? How do we know how related you are to your siblings or your family?
A small percentage.
Yeah, so you're actually very closely related to your siblings and your family, right? So if you have a 50% chance of getting a disease, that also means that other people within your family could have a 50% chance of getting a disease, right? So what if you gain information about your family or yourself? Say you get information about yourself and it says, oh, you got 50% chance of getting this disease. That's also going to give you information about a family member. And what if they don't want to know, right? Yeah.
There's also the question of getting genome tests for your children. They don't consent if you get the test done for them.
Exactly, yeah. So what if your child is very young and you're trying to see which illnesses they may or may not have, right? How can they consent to something like that that could affect their whole future, right? And so for those of you who don't have the code, it's 183163. We'll take a look at some of these. Discrimination in employment is a very good one, right? So generations giving consent. What if they use it against your religion, race, culture, right? Downstream consequences, once again. So we have all kinds of different things along those lines. What about what is considered appropriate? So when would it be okay to give consent and when would it not be okay to give consent? So what if, we talked about children, right? So what if you wanted to get genetic testing for your child, but your child had a fatal disease? Would you then waive doing it and get your test done for your child then? So those are things to think about. So what about like the somatic versus germline again? Does the consent differ there, right? So you have your body cells that are only affecting you versus cells that are affecting everyone downstream as well. Yeah, and so your genome is private, right? So your genome is private, it should be yours only, is one example, right? But your genome is not actually just yours, right? So your parents gave you some of their information, and you give some of your information to your children. So it's kind of shared. So what would you do in a shared environment like that? When you're sharing data or information, how would you go about doing that? Especially when you have differing opinions. Right, and so then we kind of talked about that. So, and there's also the problem of coercion, right? So what if you think, someone in your family might have a disease, but you need to get other information from your family members in order to determine whether or not you might get that disease? There is an issue of forced consent where you could actually force someone to give you their genetic information when they did not want to give it to you for various tests, right? And then there's also the idea of survivor's guilt, right? So what if your whole family gets tested and you're the only one that does not come back with a positive result, right? So what if you're the only one who's negative, the only one who does not have a high chance of getting a disease?
Mutation.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have a mutation as well.
Yeah, and so they may have a mutation or they may not have had a mutation, so it could go either way, absolutely. And so in that case, knowing that all of your family has a high chance, but you do not, could be survivor's guilt as well, right? All right, so what about ownership? This kind of plays right into consent, right? So now that we have ownership, so say that we own our stuff, right? Is our job allowed to touch it, right? So who owns your genetic information? Do you own your genetic information? Do your children? Does your family? Do testing companies? So what happens when you send your DNA into Ancestry.com or 23andMe or something along those lines? What happens to that? Do they have access? They are doing the testing. Do they own it to you? The insurance companies, right? We talked about this already. Are insurance companies, should they be allowed access or ownership to your data as well? What about the government or the public, right? And so the code for this one, if you'd like to input, is 560031. 560031. If you'd like to input. And so, and then who can access or view your genetic information, right? So say you have the sole right to it, then who do you allow access to, right? So who owns this information and who do you share it with, and what do you think is okay and what is not okay? So we'll leave these seconds here. Kind of a related topic.
Hasn't some of this decision already been made? Like, if you're on active duty in the military,
Right.
they take your DNA,
They do.
okay? And they own it, they have it. So if you're on active duty, they got your DNA.
Yes. Same thing goes for most high-level government offices, yeah. With FBI and stuff. And yeah, so government does, to some degree, they already take your genetic information, right? And so they do this occasionally, like occasionally when you're working in police stations, they will also take your DNA just to check to see if there was a possible cross-contamination or something like that to eliminate you as a suspect. So that is something else that does happen. Lots of times when criminals are booked, they do also get their DNA profiles taken during the process or during the booking itself, right? So your DNA can be collected in that way as well. So the government to some degree does already collect our DNA, but what do they do with it, right? And what do we want them to do with it? So that's something to consider, yeah.
There's also the insurance companies. Currently, a lot of car insurance companies want to put devices in your car that monitor how you drive, and they offer you a discount if you do that. I can see an insurance company saying, well, you give us your genetic information, we'll give you a discount on your health insurance.
Exactly.
And you're giving it away then for a fee, and you can't get it back.
Right, yeah, so that is a big concern, right? So insurance companies, they could use it against you, they could use it as a discount, but what are they going to do with that information afterwards? You can also think about the information on the internet. So that whole debate that's going on right now, what's happening to the information as I surf the internet, right? People are collecting information on us constantly. They could be doing eventually the same thing with DNA, right?
Yeah.
You had questions?
Yeah, so aren't we supposed to go ahead and destroy a sample of DNA if you're like innocent for a crime?
They are, yes. So they are supposed to delete it or get rid of it altogether. Sometimes that doesn't have to work. Just for that. But yes, they are supposed to. And something else that I would also like to mention is that there are some regulations against this stuff already put in place, but I want you guys to think about this without any regulations put in place, right? So I'm not going to actually be giving you any answers throughout this whole discussion. So, yeah, so let's see. So what if you paid a company to analyze your DNA, right? So then you could get partial or full results. So the answer is they could have anything. So anything that you give them, right, they could potentially store and use for other purposes, right? 23andMe is an example of this. 23andMe does actually send some of their data off to research companies that are doing research on diseases, illnesses, defects, stuff like that, right? But you do actually have to provide consent for those types of things, right? So do we allow these companies to just do this willy-nilly, or should they ask for consent before doing so, right? So that's kind of another concern here as well. All right, so I think we covered just about everything. All right. So if access is granted, how can they use it, right? So if we give our information to these insurance companies to get a discount, how can they use it? Can they use it then against us negatively, right? So if we give our insurance access to this and they give us a discount and then they realize, oh man, this person has a 50, 60, 70% chance of getting this illness, can we then use it to deny them access or to increase their rates, right? So that's something else to consider. All right, so justice and equity. And so you guys, has anyone read The Time Machine? Kind of talked about this a little bit, right? Yeah, so that's a good example. I'll try not to avoid too many spoilers. What about Gattaca? Does anyone watch Gattaca? All right. So what might be some pros or cons in regards to justice and equity? And again, all of these kind of tie together, but now let's think about it more in justice and equity. Let's think about it on a social way, right? So in justice, how can we use this for or against us? And in a social environment, think about culture and society and religion and race, right? How can that affect that as well? And so the code for this one, if you'd like to input, is 432029. Again, that's 432029. And so one thing that you consider is, will everyone have equal access to genome editing? What do you guys think? So think across the United States, for example. Will all races, religions, cities, countries, well, I guess the United States is one country, right? But counties, states, will they all have equal access to this genome editing technology? What about the wealthy versus the poor? Do you think the poor are going to have equal access to this technology? Maybe not, right? And so could there be downstream effects in the future? There may or may not, right? So there could be downstream effects that lead to positive or negative things, but you could also, again, get the separation in society. And then could this lead to discrimination, right? So now we have separation. We have the wealthy are editing their genome, but the poor are not able to, for example. Do we get discrimination even greater against the poor or the wealthy as a result?
You mean when Steve Jobs got a pancreatic and liver transplant ahead of everybody else? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, so
Just
yeah, I mean, you
checking-
can
I'm just
think
checking
about-
in.
Yeah. I mean, so those are all kinds of examples, yes.
In Gattaca, I thought one of the most interesting points was that, okay, the authorities had your unborn child's likely genome, and you were supposed to arrange to have a perfect, healthy, good citizen with no particular problems.
Exactly.
But then when the genome was investigated, sometimes the doctors or whoever would say, oh dear, there is a 65% chance of a massive stroke.
Exactly.
But you weren't good enough to say add 25, 35, 85. In the meantime, kids' whole life prospects are ruined. So a big part of this is the imprecision of those genetic changes.
Exactly, yeah.
And I don't think actually society would be rather rational about that. They're far more likely to say, good heavens, no, I'm not going to hire you.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, that was a very important thing in Gattaca, right?
Yeah.
So you also have, there was genome editing was widespread where they were having their children being specifically designed for specific jobs as well, right? And so then, more or less, right? And so then you can think of like, so if we are modifying these individuals for performance reasons and we're designing these children to be specifically good at these particular traits or characteristics or job qualities, what happens if someone does not want to do this genome editing and they decide to have children the natural way? That person may or may not be left behind, right? Yeah.
But the children that they have after they've edited their genes, then that taking away the children's free will.
It could, yeah. Yes?
Would you say it's ethical to try to go ahead and perfect mankind, like in the Give?
Fine.
Yeah, and so that is the
We'll
question,
send
right?
Jesse
So
Owens, that's all right. Just send Jesse Owens to jail.
should we make all of these modifications to humanity? Should we try to get rid of all disease? And then once we get rid of all disease, what's next? Do we try to, change everyone's appearance to a certain way? But you also have to remember what is the ideal, like if we're looking at perfection, what is perfection, right? So everyone has a different perspective on what perfection is, right? Just because you're tall does not mean that you may or may not, be foreseen as someone who is better or worse than someone else, right? So there are various approaches, yeah.
Of course, that's pretty far from the far less controversial argument of let's get rid of this perfectly awful condition.
Right.
Do you, on the news, they mentioned that they feel they're fairly close to genetic or treatment of retinal diseases.
It exists, yes.
And, yeah,
Mhm.
now, what have you learned about this? How likely is it? If it is really working, how can you argue
Yeah,
against
so,
this?
and we will actually talk about that in a moment, and it is here, and that therapy is the first approved gene therapy so far, yes. So we're going to go into some cases now, and I want us all to kind of discuss this. And so I want us to discuss this in person, and we can also discuss this on the little chat thing, so if you do not feel comfortable giving your opinions out loud, there is the chat, and so that's going to be, the code for that will be 545980. And I'll give that again here in a moment. But we're going to go over, the first case that we're going to go over is Dr. He's scientific modifications on 3 children in China. All right, so Dr. He, and I'm not going to pronounce his first name because my Chinese is horrible, but he was able to select several families in which he offered to do IVF. Does anyone know what IVF is? Anyone want to yell that out loud? Yeah, and so essentially what that is that's going to aid in producing children, right? So that's when you take sperm and an egg outside of the bodies and you create an embryo, right? And so you create this embryo and then you would implant it back into an individual in order to bring children to term, potentially, right? Usually they will implant several embryos in hopes that 1 or 2 of them might attach. Yes.
So it's called twins and triplets.
Yep.
I don't need more.
Yeah. So you can get multiple children. Yes, absolutely. And so Dr. He found some families that had HIV, okay? And so HIV can be passed down to your children, right? And so he found some parents who had HIV and told them, hey, I would like to do IVF for your family, but when I work with these embryos, I would like to genetically modify these embryos so that they are immune to HIV. And what he did is he was trying to simulate natural immunities that are within the world population, right? And so there are several people in the world who do have mutations on the CCR5 gene. And so you can see the CCR5 on that little diagram up there is actually one of the receptors that grabs HIV and brings it into the cell. And so there are people who have natural immunity that do not have a working or a CCR5 receptor that looks in this way, right, or works in this manner, and they might not have one altogether. And so this prohibits HIV from entering the cell and replicating as it should, or at an exponential rate. Sometimes it can just do it, but it'll just die out inside you because it's not able to replicate fast enough. So he wanted to mimic this mutation that happens naturally in humans on his own. And so he offered to do this for these families. He would genetically alter these embryos, implant them into the parents, and then bring babies to term and see what happened. He did use CRISPR-Cas9, so he used that edit in order to change that gene, right, and to simulate that effect, okay? So what do you guys think? Should he have done this in order to protect these babies from getting HIV? Yes?
As I've read on something about this, as I remember, it's not obvious, first of all, that this is the only gene that works in this case.
Yeah.
It certainly wasn't informed consent by the recipient, and I don't think he had approval from the government to do it.
No, he's in jail.
Right, yeah, and so that's why I
Other
didn't
than
really
that,
want
it
to
was
do
a brilliant idea.
that. Because I wanted to just think, before, we get into the consequences of what happened here, should we even attempt to do this, right? And so you brought up several good things, right? And so the first one was, maybe he didn't get proper consent from not only the unborn children, but maybe consent wasn't done properly within the parents and the hospitals and the university and the government and all that stuff as well, right? But then on top of that, what if it didn't work as expected? We do not know very much about the genome. We mentioned this several times before. What if it worked as expected? What if it didn't work as expected? So if it did go as expected, would this be great or would this be horrible still, do you think? So say you made those edits and it took place as expected.
Be inclined to say a good thing.
Yeah.
I'd be inclined to say, okay, a good thing. Obviously, as you pointed out, not available to a good portion of humanity. But there are ways for an HIV-infected mother to have a healthy baby without going that far. I've seen heavy infusions of drugs when the baby is born, and the kid is fine.
Yeah.
So,
But the success rate might not be guaranteed, right? And so the idea behind this was to prevent it altogether and not have to go through
How do
that
they know
process.
for sure that it's working or not? Is it going to try to give
Right.
the kids the...
Exactly, and so these are questions that they should ask, right? And so they did ask, and so he did initial results where he took a large number of embryos before implantation, and he tested a very large number of embryos to see if it looked as if the changes had taken place, right? So your embryos are a cluster of cells, and so you can see kind of in this lower little GIF here, that blue one, that's where you're kind of inserting some information into your embryo, and then the embryo multiplies and creates lots of cells, right? And so your embryo isn't just going to be one cell, right? It's going to be hundreds upon hundreds of cells. So what he did is he took 200 or so cells from each one of those embryos to test to see if the implementation went right. And what do you think might be the issue with that when you're only taking 200 cells from an embryo?
Small sample size.
Small sample size, right? And so we think back to mosaicism, right? So if you took 200 cells and 90% of them came back positive for the change, how do you know that that took place throughout the entire embryo itself, right? And so that's something else that you have to consider. And then he also had, he had mentioned that he would, once the babies were born, he would continue doing testing to make sure that they were healthy and okay and to see how it affected their bodies, right, and their genome. But with so many unknowns, would you do this with your children? You guys think? So if you didn't know what the downstream effects were going to be like 50 years from now, would you do this with your children? If it meant preventing them from getting HIV at all? Yeah.
You're back to the same problem as, do we develop a vaccine for coronavirus?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we can develop a vaccine in 2 or 3 months, but you can't give it to anybody until you've tested it on mice, and then tested on a small sample to see if it works,
Exactly, yeah.
and then up to a big sample to see if it actually works.
Right.
I don't think he tested this on, I don't know, we even
Yeah,
tested on
so
mice.
you can test it on mice. So mice have been tested on. They've also brought embryos. They've done testing on embryos since like 2011 or something like that, 2015, where they've actually done edits to embryos, but they would never bring them to term. So they have been doing testing, but that's not long term, right? An embryo is a short part of our lives. So how do we know what's going to happen later on? We can do mouse, pig, monkey models, but are those going to happen the same way that it would happen in us? Yes.
So, I'd say my feel is probably that it might become the clone, sort of how vaccines are today.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, what if you don't want to have your body notified? And yet the government says, oh, we're going to go ahead and eradicate, the coronavirus or Ebola, and we want to go ahead and do this treatment.
Yeah. Yeah. No, those are all great points, right? Yeah.
One more is that this was something to give some people what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have children, they wanted to have. It's the most basic need for a lot of people, or desire for a lot of people. But it was not to fix somebody who had a
Right.
problem. It's to give somebody the opportunity to repair
Right.
it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, think about it with other diseases as well. Say you have Huntington's, or Parkinson's, which both have a high rate of being passed down to your children. What if you had Huntington's or Parkinson's and you wanted your children to not come down with the same ailment? Would that change that for you guys? That decision?
That's your spouse.
Yeah. And so that's something else you can do, right? So we'll say you're getting married and your spouse, and you want to know, you guys want to have children, do you ask your spouse to get genetically tested so that you guys can determine whether or not your children will have this or not, right?
Yes.
Subjective.
What if your spouse does not want it? Right? So these are all things to consider. So what if I told you, so we kind of all, I think there's numerous of us who would like to say that if this worked the way that it should have or would have or hoped we wanted it to, that this would be a great thing to eliminate HIV, because presumably these children, their children would not be able to get HIV also. So further down the line, we could possibly eradicate HIV from human
So that's
population
for that
altogether.
specific strain of HIV, because there's not just one HIV.
Right, yeah, so
Okay,
hypothetically
let's
this
be clear,
would
there's
work,
a whole array of
Right.
HIV.
hypothetically this would work for most, not all.
It's like anthrax, the government injects military with a vaccine for anthrax. Like, there's only one strain of anthrax that they're hoping that's what's going to take place, but there's like 12 different variations.
Yeah, and not all strains are going to be harmful either, right? Or they'll have different levels of harm compared to another, right? Yeah, and so one of the points that's brought up is that he did test lots and lots and lots of embryos before he implanted ones that he thought had the highest rate, right? And you can see here that they, depending on what you think of an embryo, right, they could be destroying numerous embryos, right, possible lives, okay? So that's another topic for discussion as well. Now, what if I told you that Dr. He did not get consent from the university. He did not inform the university or the hospital that did the implantation that these were genetically modified babies. What if I also told you that he deceptively modified or forged his ethics review and his clinical trials? But if I also told you that he said that he would pay the parents for this process, but if they backed out, they would have to pay them back?
Yeah, justify this.
Exactly. Yeah, so there are very strict regulations against doing this kind of stuff. So what if it's desperate measures, and what if he did all of this and bypassed all these laws and regulations in order to do these things? And it worked out, right? Then it would be great, and we probably wouldn't be, condemning him. But since he did not do things as expected or as he should have, we're condemning him. So something that brings along is that he tried to publish in numerous journals. There was one journal, Nature in particular, who said that they would not publish this because of its ethics, right? And they did not want to be part of it. And there were several other papers who actually sought out this, right? And so they sought out his research and tried to publish it because they said, if I quote, "If someone thinks it's scientifically valid but not ethical, does that mean the study should stay in the shadows?" Right? Because even though he did this and bypassed all these laws and regulations, it did not go the way that he should have. What happens if this gives us insight into curing diseases in the future, right? So before we were kind of at a standstill to where we could not do this research in order to learn what the downstream effects were going to be. But now that this has happened, we can learn what the downstream effects might be. Right? So how would you think that now that it's done, what would happen, right? Should we just ignore it? Because as of right now, this paper is basically inaccessible. It is very difficult to find, and you cannot access it very easily. Because everyone has pretty much banished it because they do not want to be part of this ethical decision, right? So, do we still think that research is valid? Should research in medical journals be the be the ethical police for research such as this? Yeah.
Since I assume there will be no follow-up on these babies as they go,
Right now, correct.
then it's worthless anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, and so there are some suggestions from scientists saying that we need third-party analyses, so people who are not directly involved in this research, to do several independent analyses of these children in order to evaluate what actually happened, what went down, if the things that we expected to happen are actually happening, and what the downstream effects might be, right?
Since the Chinese government is so appalled at this,
Right.
I can't see that happening.
Yeah, and so one of the other effects, so there's two sides of this. I think that this research might have inspired others to start doing more research similarly to this, and to learn more about genetically modifying children, or sex cells, right? But then there's other people who suggest that this study might have scared us away completely from doing this research. And right now it's kind of looking more like that, because now everyone's trying to bury this research in the dust, right? And so they want this to just go away. And so, does this also hurt us? If we are so frightened by this research, could that also hurt us in future research as well? So that's another way to think about it. What do you guys think about that? Yeah.
If the journals act as ethical police with some agreement between them, then the desire or the motive to do this kind of research and bend the rules, because you're going to get published and become famous anyway, that motive kind of goes away. You don't get published, which is the big thing
Exactly.
for a researcher.
Right, yeah.
So
But what if he did it right? Do you think he would have been banished?
if he had gotten all of the approvals from the government
Right.
and all of the correct approvals, then maybe it would have come out. But that would have been with all of the approvals and all of the
Right.
rules followed, you know.
Yeah, yes.
Since this sort of research is so rife with this sort of thing, I don't see any way to allow it to go on without careful ethics controls. We're going to have a board that approves doing this. I mean, it's going to be, you can't do it in your backyard.
Right.
So that means you got to do it in a university or a medical center. And I can only see doing this with the approval of a board of ethicists,
Right.
medical people, a whole thing. You know, there's too much risk at the end, and if it doesn't work out, you end up with a situation like this, we can't publish it.
Exactly.
So I think you really have to have an approval board. But yes, you can do this research, and we want to know exactly what you're doing, how you're doing it, how you're getting approval, how you're getting consent, the whole 9 yards. And then but without that, this becomes, you know, cutting up people in your backyard.
Yeah, sure. And so here's another question for you. Do you think all countries would regulate this the same way?
Unfortunately, no.
Right. So what happens if the United States has very strict regulations, but another country does not?
The researchers moving together.
You still got to do what's right.
Yeah. Yes.
From what I see, this is ethicists perform really valuable work. They do. But boards of ethics tend to enforce the status quo. They're very conservative by nature.
Right.
They can't be. They wouldn't really have a purpose if they weren't. But on the other hand, by their very nature, they're going to quash the next major breakthrough.
Right.
So it's almost something that can't be it can't be decided this way, because it's all going to happen anyway.
Yeah,
Yes. Sorry.
oh, I was just saying it can't be undone.
Right.
His name should be removed. He shouldn't make money because he's stepped over the boundaries, but somebody should have it. Something along
Yeah,
that line.
yeah, so that's definitely one route to go, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, it would seem like in the sweep of time, you know, in the future, a lot of this is technology driven. And in a competitive world, I mean, the nations that have the best technology tend to prevail. And, you know, you may not do it, it may have a lot of ethical and justifiably so inhibitions, but others may. And without a world governing body, others may, then you're behind.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can think of the differences between first world and third world countries, right? And so that's why,
I think that you have to go ahead and decide whether or not the benefits go ahead and justify the efficacy of the
Right.
experiment. Like, for example, after World War II, actually, most of the biological research actually came from the Japanese who experimented on people.
It's not that we haven't realized for some time that our technological skills are getting way ahead of our capacity to make ethical judgments. I believe every large hospital does already have ethical committees, very
Correct,
often
yes.
clergy, doctors, and they
All
have to consider
universities.
such things as my mother, a very experienced old nurse, used to say, when do you quietly pull the plug? So, yeah, you need people to consider this. I will also tell you, again, what my mother said, doctors want no part of these decisions. As a rule, you know,
Yeah.
call your priest, minister, or rabbi, or I'll listen to the judge, thank you, otherwise leave me alone. Are we so sure that this would give such a tremendous advantage to a nation, maybe to a specialized group of athletes? Another thing that struck me in that very good movie, Advent, was the character who was definitely bred to be a top-notch runner, I think, got hit by a car.
Yep.
Spent his whole life in a wheelchair. No one is a good part of life, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So we can do without it.
Yeah.
There are examples of technology out of control. I mean, it's very nice to have ultrasound to see if your baby works out okay. But the Indians and the Chinese babies, to some extent, have taken it to the point of, oh, it's a girl, I'll get an abortion. Because they only want male babies. And then they end up with, 27 males to every female. And that's a serious cultural problem.
There was one whole government unit, I forget what they call it in India, that a few months ago said that they needed receiving not one female child had been born. On males. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so that comes back down to, do we expect, so if we do decide to come up with a governing body, do we let the countries do it, or do we come up with an international committee, right? So I think that's something that might may or may not decide. May or may not be.
But now back to, curing the present disease in an existing human being. I would like to hear more about that, like the rectal process.
Yeah. And so that makes a good segue into our next case here, right? So disabilities and defects, right? So now we were talking about fatal diseases. Now let's talk about disabilities and defects. They may or may not be fatal, right? Most of these, actually all of these, are not fatal. So what do you think? Would you use genetic modification or genetic information in order to alleviate, manipulate, or eliminate diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's? What about autism and ADHD? What about depression or anxiety? Insomnia or sleep apnea? Cleft palate or club foot? Deafness or paralysis, for example? Would you get these? Where do you draw the line between when is okay and when is not okay, right? So you have serious diseases, and you have ones that people may consider to be less serious diseases. So when would you draw that line? Would you draw that line at mental health disorders? Would you draw the line at progressive diseases? Would you not mess with any of these? Would you mess with all of them, right? And so if you wanted to participate in this one is 691205. Again, this poll is 691205. Yes?
If it's at the point where we know it has no side effects, and it works, I don't see any reason not to cure any disease. Make somebody immune to measles or chickenpox or whatever. If it has no side effects other than what it's supposed to do, then I don't see any reason not to.
Some of our greatest engineers are
on the spectrum, some of our greatest artists and.
Right.
Are.
Yeah, so then it comes down to, is this actually, do you actually consider this to be a disability or a defect, right? So autism, there are many people who do not consider autism to be a negative thing. They consider it to be a culture of its own, and they think they are just as much human as the rest of us. And how are we to dictate what is the norm and what is not the norm? Are all of these, minus all of these defects or deformities or disabilities, are they what we consider to be negative, or are they just another part of life? Yes.
Just a question, context. Does all this genetic modification have to be, when does it occur? Must it occur at the cellular,
At
the
the somatic
genome?
cells or the,
I'm sorry.
so the body cells versus the sex cells?
Yeah, and does it have to be prenatal or
It
is some of it like?
depends on what you're doing, yeah. So there are some, like the blindness one that we were talking about earlier, that one does not need to be done in sex cells. That one can be in someone who is already fully grown and will not affect your children. And that brings up another point. So what if you personally do not want to have a high case of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or blindness or deafness or something like that, but you don't want to make that decision for your child. Maybe your child would consider blindness or deafness to be a positive rather than a negative. So how do you think it's okay in that case, or do you think you would do it in your sex cells? Yes.
We make lots of decisions for minor kids. I can't see consulting them on something that is that serious. Blindness, deafness, okay. If they project to be 7 feet tall, okay, then maybe there would have been an argument. Then there's such a, are there other ways to treat some of these defects? It would be, I certainly would rather if operations are widely available worldwide. I really don't know for cleft lip, club feet. Let's not fool around with altering genes. Let's just fix the problem if it can be fixed.
Sure, that is one option, absolutely. So we're going to actually continue this discussion, but we're going to move on to the case of inherited retinal disease. And so this is actually the first ever approved FDA gene therapy, right? And so that's Luxturna, right? And so something to consider, it does increase your vision, so it has a 65% chance of vision improvement with very minor to no side effects. However, check out that price tag. $850,000. Most cases are not improved by insurance. So your chances of getting approved for insurance for this are very minimal, and they do have payment programs, but I can tell you right now it is not much of a help, right? So what do you guys think are some pros and cons, right? So you have increased vision, but you also have to pay almost $1 million in order to do it.
It's a house in LA.
Yeah.
I sweat it.
And so, again, this code for this one, if you want to input onto the chat here, is 691205. Yes.
I think, like most products, when it enters the market, the price and the availability of how good it is are always going to be kind of iffy. But over time, the price tag should go down, and the effectiveness should go up as the technology is improved.
Right.
The prototype is never the final product. It was put out on the assembly line.
Right.
In case of point, Henry Ford's first car. Right, now we've got modern Ford cars that are probably lower price tag and many more things. So I don't see an $850,000 price tag as an immediate con, because I know that the price will go down.
What if I told you that the CEO admitted that they chose the price based on knowing that people would pay the price, and not based on research or development? So this price was not from research and development, it was a result of thinking how much people would actually be willing to pay for a treatment such as this.
You can probably go to the market and see, is there going to be a demand for a price tag this high? And if so, then the price is justified. If not, then you have to wait for the demand to continue to increase.
Right, and so then what about, that also comes down to the wealthy versus the poor, cultural differences or race differences, right? So what if one group of people is able to completely eliminate blindness, but another group of people is not? Yeah.
People are looking for details on this, if they're known yet, how much improvement in vision is there?
65%.
So in biological terms, this can be the difference between being very disabled and being functional.
Correct. Yes.
And I'd say citizens deserve to have the taxpayer pay for it. I can see a counter argument, though I'm afraid that the parents know that this was like, that doesn't help the kid though.
Yeah.
But I'd be inclined to say this whole citizens should be entitled to.
Yes.
I don't see this as a genetic thing. I see this as if Bernie Sanders was doing something about the damn drug companies. I mean,
Right,
the
isn't
fact
that
that
part
they
of
can
the
get
ethical
away with
debate
this
on
sort of
gene therapy?
thing is ridiculous. You know, charging $80,000 for hepatitis C drug or whatever they get, that costs 50 cents. I mean, something needs to be done about that, and that's my personal gripe. It has nothing to do with genetics or any of those things. It's just a rip-off that they get away with and shouldn't be allowed to.
But that's a political,
That's my political opinion.
a lot of other
In general, I would agree with, the price tag doesn't preclude anyone from eventually being treated. All it does is order the lines.
But then should they be allowed to do that?
Why not? We do with everything else.
Yeah,
The
but should
early,
everything
the
be
early
allowed?
adopters, the early adopters pay the huge price. And then they discover, we don't have anyone else to sell it to, so the price goes down.
I'd be inclined to, neurologically, I don't think that a child who had not been able to receive treatment would be able at 40 or 50, or even 20. But then I think you tell me the brain is set up. I'll bet it wouldn't work after that.
To my understanding, this works for all ages, this treatment. I could be wrong. Yes.
So how I see it is that we always do have this problem. You see, if you look at countries that, or like third world countries like North Korea, they can, most of the people like have blindness or other ailments because they just cannot afford the technologies to, help
Right.
the people.
So would that separate our countries even more, do you think?
I think so, yes.
And so then so another thing to consider is that, what if the blind community, right, so the blind community, they have a language of their own, they have a system of their own, they have a culture of their own, they have communities of their own. What if us suggesting that this is an impairment that needs to be fixed via therapy like this, what do you think, how do you think that could impact them? Do you think they would want to change? Yeah, right, so that could cause discrimination in that sense as well, right? Yeah.
Well, some people do not put cochlear implants into their children. They could use them because they feel that the child was born deaf and should stay that way. And they communicate with them through sign language.
Yeah.
Now, I personally think that's wrong, but, that's their opinion. And I've never been in a situation where I had to make that decision.
Right, yeah.
I'd be inclined to say parental rights until that kid is at a rather arbitrary age of 18. And I was rather relieved to read that now older cochlear implants seem to be working. Because that's quite a burden to put on a kid because you don't want them to leave your culture.
Right, and so that comes back down to consent. When do we consent, right? So if we were to allow these therapies to progress, do we make the decision for people, or do we allow people to make the decision for themselves if they want to be part of that community or not, right?
Will the government make the decision?
Should the government make that decision?
Parents, however,
Parents, yes.
have a little area of interfering with parental rights unless it's a life and death matter.
I think another thing you can say is that this also can boil down to the argument whether healthcare is a service or a right. Because if it's a service that you pay for, then the price tag is justified. But if you believe that healthcare is a right for everyone, which is a political topic, then the price tag is not justified, and it needs to be available for everyone regardless. So maybe an upcoming ethical argument is going back to that healthcare service versus right thing.
This price tag just seems ridiculous to me. They're definitely, it has nothing to do with just Americans or US citizens. It has everything to do with the global. They just want all the rich people in the global world, you know, and so much of what they've done was research from universities in the first place.
Yes,
You know,
I
mean,
can
to
tell
think
you.
that they did this on their own is ridiculous.
Yes, so the way that this company works, just some more background for you guys, this was a nonprofit company. As soon as they developed the drug, they became a for-profit company.
False.
Something else to think about.
But I mean, they're here, they should, you know, they should, they're, yeah.
So this research for this drug was done, yes, on university money, taxpayer
That brings up a good question for NAU. Who's the largest funder for NAU for research? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to know if you can share that.
Oh,
with us.
boy, that,
I think it's probably the
government
federal
for sure,
government and
yes.
it's the state that
Yeah.
are the largest investors.
So I would say
into
federal
the
government
university
and
research
state.
program, right? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Because all the MIT is all big.
Any other questions about this one before we move on?
Does this inherited disease affect in America? Which is where I'm supposed to know. How many people are we talking about that this drug would help in our country?
I'm not actually sure. I don't have the numbers and the percentages that it could do. I don't know what the population,
Because that becomes another ethical question,
Right.
how much, the orphan drug question. Yeah, the drug works great, very small number of people, who's gonna pay to develop and use it.
Sure. Yes.
You defined it as the first approved, assuming FDA approved.
Yes.
Genetic treatment. And so it was approved based, I guess, just on the science.
Correct.
Even though there's lots of considerations about the cost, and that a reasonable cost could have been determined, but they didn't bother with that. They just went, what the market would bear. They thought, perhaps our approval system should be modified.
Sure. Yes. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on. Sorry, do you have one question?
It was just a comment, really, just thinking about that the price really does create kind of an income divide. Because even people that can scrounge together the money or use payment plans to pay for this drug probably aren't willing to because the percentage is higher
Yeah.
for them to make that decision.
Absolutely, and so there are some scientists who think that a price tag like this could lead to more social separation. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I would think that in hearing that the FDA is rushing drugs through, I would say what type of FDA approval, authorizations, hoops they have to go through to have
Yeah, for this one, I believe it was fairly expensive. So they did have to go through the whole clinical trial process. I do not know to what extent that was, though.
On the other hand, which of us wishes to look desperate parents in the eye? Parents who've just been told their child and their new baby will go blind and say, well, you know, we couldn't really approve this one because there were ethical considerations. Yeah, the drug exists, but, you know, we have to think about it a lot longer. You can't do that.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to this one here. This one I'm going to make a quick one. So Josiah Zahner, former NASA employee, injected himself with CRISPR, and he would actually make kits out of his garage that he would sell to anyone who would come to him. They would range anywhere from $20 to several $1,000s. And he would basically give people kits that could potentially alter their genome, saying that, here, we have this. This is going to prolong your life. This is going to cure this ailment. This is going to help you become faster. This is going to help you do whatever, right? So he would come up, and he's not the only one, unfortunately. He's several people all developed these kits that they would sell out of their backyards, and they sell them as DIY bioengineering kits. None of these are medical professionals, most of them anyway are not medical professionals, and these kits have not been through those rigorous scientific clinical trials, right? So one of the questions here is that, is this his choice? It's his body. Should he be allowed to do whatever he wants to do? Or is this dangerous and should he be stopped? Right? So what do you guys think?
Did he get paid?
Yes, he got paid. People would pay him anywhere from $20 to several thousand for these kits.
Or even in a free market, if his product is not successful, then people will stop buying it.
Yeah, but it's FDA's gonna shut it down.
Yeah, they are not.
In a free market, right, not FDA.
So FDA doesn't currently have regulations on these, very strict regulations. So it just, I would say, similarly as vitamins right now. Yes.
I don't really think it's right to go and put a product out there that could not be safe. We don't know if it's safe or not.
So yeah, but if you go out and buy this kit and you know the risks and you know that there isn't scientific research behind this, is it your right to make that choice, or should you not be allowed to do it? Should we stop it or not? Do you guys think? Yeah.
There are lots of things that are sold today that, you know, even on television, that say at the bottom, this drug has not been approved by the FDA to do whatever we're claiming it does. And there are doctors who will inject you with all kinds of things that supposedly will make you live to 200 years and whatnot. If he wants to sell it, and there are people out there who are stupid enough to go along with it, fine.
Where do we draw the line though? Do we draw the line at vitamins, or do we draw the line here? And what if it was dangerous? So what if he was selling this out of his backyard and people
The FDA should, in principle, be able to regulate dangerous products. And for a long time, people sold stuff that had radium in them that was supposed to prolong life. They sold all sorts of chemicals, you know, formaldehyde would preserve yourself or something. And the FDA was essentially set up to regulate that. So I don't see any regulation. I mean, if the FDA thinks this is dangerous, then the FDA has a perfect case to shut it down.
Sure.
Otherwise, he can sell it.
Well, it's my bank account, so if I believe that that prince in Nigeria really needs the money, it's my right to give him that money. Why would you want to do anything to that prince in Nigeria? And if I'm that dumb, why would you not want to protect me because I am incapable of making decisions for myself?
Sure. Yes.
We do have regulations, and it is not based on, boy, you were dumb enough to stumble into this yourself. There are many very vulnerable people. I think the criterion now, which allows all sorts of strange things to be sold to improve your health, is still, well, it doesn't do any harm. And I think that does have to be looked at when you are talking about a great deal of money, and maybe people under 18 shouldn't be allowed to play with this. We're enough sold that the FDA has some notion of whether it actually did any harm to anyone. But at some point, you have to protect people who are 18 come, and I doubt there's any evidence that any of this worked.
In the very back.
So,
Yeah, you have stuff that's sold that is allowed by the FDA, like creatine or marijuana. But the risk or put out there for the consumer to decide, should I try it or not? I think that should be the same case for these, DNA modification kits.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
How does someone who buys this know what to do with it?
He gives them instructions.
How can you give someone instructions?
As much as anyone else who visits the internet. Yeah.
Okay, this brings to mind the same thing that came to stem cells. And all of a sudden, you start hearing these steps. You watch the kind of stem cells you get, where you get them.
Right.
Okay, so I heard that, and then all of a sudden something came up on my website. And I think this kind of falls in that category.
Oh, it does, yeah.
Where you need to let out, and you need to educate the public.
Yes, 100%. Absolutely. All right, so we're going to go to the last one, and then we'll wrap up. All right, so familial DNA. So, Golden State Killers. Anyone heard of that?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So, Joseph J. D'Angelo, former police officer, he committed about, I believe it was about 15 murders and over 50 rapes, over 120 burglaries, over the span of 40 years, and those are only the confirmed cases. He was an active serial rapist for those 40 years. It was a cold case. They could not find him or locate him. They had very few suspects, and they had even fewer evidence, right? The biggest problem is that the police departments were unable to communicate with each other as far as DNA evidence goes, right? So this guy went undetected for 40 years, was active up until this day, and they were starting to lose any chance of getting him. So they came across an idea in which they would upload some of the partial DNA samples that they had into one of those DNA databases. This particular one was called GED Match, and this was an open source DNA company. And so basically what you would do is you would get your kits done through 23andMe or Ancestry.com. You get that data afterwards, and then you can upload it into these open source programs for ancestry-related reasons, for health-related reasons, to loan your data to researchers, however you would like to do it. The police use this in order to upload his DNA and to create a family tree. They were able to isolate around 20 distant relatives, of which they would then go through one by one, doing good old police work, trying to figure out which ones made sense and narrow down the list. So up until then, they had a very, very large suspect pool, and they were able to use this to limit it down to a single individual who was recently arrested. What do you guys think? Should we use DNA for these purposes or not? Yes, in the back.
I'd say that if it's privately held DNA, it should not be used, but if you go and let it go public, then I'd say yes.
Yes.
I think that if I remember correctly when they did this, though, the people who were contributing their DNA weren't necessarily agreeing, they weren't really sure what it was going to be used for, and I think GEDmatch has since changed their by whatever terms and conditions.
They now ask you if you would like to consent to police.
Right.
But beforehand, the police just went onto this database and were just building trees without consent, right? So how do you gain consent in that case? So you have all these DNA. There's not very much information associated with this DNA, so how do you get consent from this information, right? And so GED Match and Ancestry and 23andMe have all since then added clauses into their documents requesting that if you want to donate your DNA for these purposes, you can, but you have to opt in now. But what if we didn't, right? So what if we didn't have these consent requests? How would we go about doing this? What do you guys think? Say you uploaded your DNA to this and someone used it for these purposes. Yes?
Well, presumably, if you say you want your DNA to be in a public database, and it's in a public database, and what the police do with it is no longer your business, you gave it away. If you say no, and they think that's a problem.
What if you were under the assumption that it was only going to be for ancestry and research purposes?
If you sign something that says it's for that, then yes, that would be a problem.
Sure.
But as long as it's in a public database, you sign your life away every time you log in, you sign one of those things for Google, Facebook, or whatever, and they're using your data.
Yes.
Some of your data, it's a little more intimate,
Right.
but it's out there. And, well, they match it, and, maybe you were the criminal and you downloaded your database and were stupid enough to do that, or he's your fourth cousin.
So, yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you guys one more question because we only have a few minutes left. And I'm going to give you guys one more question. When do we draw the line? So is this only okay for murderers and serial rapists or cold cases? Do we only use it for cold cases? Do we only use it for murderers? Do we only use it for rapists? Do we only use it for burglaries? Do we only use it for possession charges? What about theft or people getting in a fight or someone breaking into someone else's house or kidnapping? When do we draw the lines?
It's kind of like fingerprints, like, every job you ever have, you take your fingerprints, it's now in the database, whatever. I think like, what's out there is out there.
Yeah. So one thing that I will tell you is that the police departments prior to these cases were not able to really give information between each other. And so that's why it took so long for him to get caught. One of the many reasons is that one police department had a DNA sample, another police department had another DNA sample, and just until recently, they just now made the connection. So should we make databases across police departments that hold all of this DNA? There are federal ones, but those are for FBI cases, right? Or for federal jobs, yes.
We do fingerprints.
Yeah.
This is no different.
Should we do DNA profiling? So if we all put our DNA into a system right now, who's to say that people are going to use that for a good or bad cause?
Then I draw the line. If I want to get my DNA to a public database, that's fine. If they get it because I committed a crime and it's in the database, that's also fine. Just
So-
like they take my fingerprints. if I
Right,
commit-
so we get fingerprinting for a certain job. What if they get rid of fingerprinting altogether and say, give me a DNA sample instead? Yes.
Well, there's been times in which DNA has been used to prove the innocence of people who have been put in prison.
Absolutely.
Because fingerprints, even though they're quite accurate, they can go ahead and, mess up. They're not perfect. DNA is perfect,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah, so we can use this to resolve crimes that have been improperly, conducted, or ones that have been falsely accused, right? So that can be used for that.
I think involving people is perfect. There have been cases thrown out because the DNA was not collected properly, or was the sample was not stored properly. So nothing is perfect, but I really can't see objecting to having police departments communicate with each other. But I'd like to know, what is the legal status usually if the police knock on your door and say, sir, madam, you are certainly not under any suspicion, we already know you live in another country at the time.
Right.
We really would like your DNA sample as part of our investigation.
You have to consent to it.
But does this happen?
Yes.
Okay, I've seen TV shows where, the cop simply waits until you leave the table and then takes your use.
Yeah, so they didn't actually get his DNA, so in order to confirm this, they didn't actually get his DNA from a swab or anything like that. They actually got it from things that he discarded and from door handles and stuff like that.
So that's legal, the judges have decided.
Correct, yeah, if it's not part of his property, then yes.
So it's gonna happen, might as well organize it.
Alrighty, so that's all I have for you guys tonight. Thank you for that long discussion.